Sukhbir Dhar, whose topic of discourse is On the Sound of Knocking in Macbeth. And in the afternoon, it's Dr. Supanta Bhattacharya with The Purpose of Mystical Phenomena in Macbeth. Now, before I invite Dr. Subir Dhar, let me introduce you to this eminent speaker. This multifaceted personality is currently working as Dean, School of Humanities, Director of the School of International Languages, and mentor and advisor to the Department of English at Sister Nivedita University, Calcutta. Apart from being a professor of English, he has served as officiating Vice Chancellor at Rabindra Bharati University. He has also worked as Director of University School of Languages and Culture and has been Honorary Director of the Kewalramani Center. It's indeed an honor to have Dr. Subir Dhar with us today. So over to you, sir, with On the Sound of Knocking in Macbeth. Over to Subir Dhar, sir.
Well, first of all, good morning, everybody. It's nice to be here with you all today, partly because you see my association with the Shakespeare Society of Central India goes back several years, and I would really like to thank the organizers for inviting me to deliver this talk to you. Among my good old friends is, of course, your president, Professor Pranoti Chakrabarti, and who I've known for many, many years, and it's been a pleasure to be associated with her and with you all today. Let me explain. Yes, Pranati.
Welcome to Nagpur and to SSCI.
Well, virtually this time, but I have many pleasant memories of the time, of the wonderful days I spent in Nagpur, in your company, your and your friends' company, and we had lovely, I think, a great time together in the past. Very academic, very serious, but fun nonetheless. Okay, let me come to what I'm going to talk about today. You see, many of you here are, I think, students. Many of you are perpetual students like me and like Pranoti here. In the sense, you see, we are still in the learning curve. We are still in the process of knowing much more about Shakespeare, a lot more than what we knew in the past. Let me tell you at this point that what I'm going to talk about today is something which is one of the most iconic scenes from Shakespeare. This scene is Act 2, Scene 3 from Shakespeare's Macbeth, which is also called the Porter scene. And you know, this scene has been the locus of a lot of critical activity, a lot of critical thought, opinion, thinking for the past 200 plus years. Now, I want to make an intervention at this point because I'm going to claim that there are things about this scene that people have not regarded, have not looked at over 200 plus years. And this is something that we need to look at today in the 21st century, sitting here today in Nagpur and Kolkata and in India in general. The reason is one of the greatest things about Shakespeare is that there are so many things about Shakespeare, so many aspects about Shakespeare that are still to be explored. And this is going to be my take on the Porter scene in Macbeth. Now, to start off with, you see, if you look at the opening scene of Act 2, Scene 3 of Macbeth, I think this is a very unique, a very special kind of a scene. Why? Because you see, this is one of the very few places in Shakespeare, or for that matter, anywhere in world drama, where you have a dialogue. Now, you see, a dialogue is, of course, essential to any play. You have two speakers on stage, actors who talk to each other, and you sitting in the audience can hear them speak to each other, and you make your own conclusions about the people who are talking. Here in this scene, however, there's something which is completely different. And that is, you see, this scene is featuring a dialogue not between two actors, but rather, much more importantly, a dialogue between a man on the stage, the porter who's acting this role, and more importantly, the sound of knocking. So you see, the first thing that I like to draw your attention to is this unique factor, unique feature, unique ability of Shakespeare to bring into his plays a kind of a dialogic intervention between a sound and a man on the stage. Now, this is something I claim, and I hope to show you, to demonstrate to you in the course of the next few minutes. This is something that has never been looked at in the history of the criticism of the Porter scene in Macbeth. Now, that's the first point that I would try to make. The point that you see, this is a dialogue, a long and sustained dialogue, embodied not as an exchange of speech between two actors, as is the norm in theatre, but between an offstage sound of knocking and the words of a man spoken on the stage. And you see, what underscores this as very special is the fact that in Macbeth, the sound of knocking is heard not once but twice. And before the sound of knocking in the Porter, and before the Porter engages with the sound of knocking through a series of dialogues, there had been the scene before, that is Act 2, Scene 2, the murder scene as we call it. In the murder scene, you see, the sound of knocking had been heard also. Because you see, Macbeth comes back from murdering Duncan, his hands of blood stained, he's carrying the dripping with blood daggers in his hand, and he is talking to his wife when the sound of knocking is first heard. And notice, they refer to the sound, but they do not refer to the sound as a kind of a urgent call for action. Lady Macbeth is quite dismissive of the sound of action. She says, yes, someone's come. And then she says, a little water clears of this reed. In other words, you see, what Shakespeare is indicating there by the first sound of knocking is a different scenario altogether of human reaction to the sound of knocking. And that's the first point that I'd like to make. The point that in the Porter scene, you have this actually unprecedented dialogic and acoustic impact. And you see, this is something that I think has been overlooked in the almost 2.5 centuries long history of the critical regarding of the scene. Let me explain this a little further. You see, during the 18th century and even during the early 19th century, critics had obviously talked about the Porter scene. And most of this reaction had been simply negative and dismissive. For example, you see, you had early critics like Pope and Hamner. Alexander Pope, as you know, who wrote his very famous, who composed his very famous edition of Shakespeare sometime between 1725 and 28, Pope had said that the Porter's lines, the whole dialogues of the Porters, are not important. And therefore, if you look at the edition that Pope printed or published of his particular text of Shakespeare's Macbeth, you will find at the bottom of the, you will find a line right across the page, and the Porter's dialogues are printed under that line. In other words, by drawing a literal border, Pope is suggesting that the Porter's lines are not authentic Shakespeare, and therefore they are a kind of an interpolation by the actors, and because they are interpolations by the actors, they have to be demarcated as such, as I said, framed between two horizontal lines in the text to make the reader conscious that this is not Shakespeare's words. So you see, Porter and Pope do not go together. In fact, Pope is saying that the Porter is actually specious stuff. This is interpolations by the actors, and therefore it is not authentic Shakespeare. That is what Pope says. Not only that, you see, there was another critic, a man called Harry Rao. Harry Rao published his edition of Shakespeare's Macbeth, and it was a very expensive edition. In those days, it used to cost 9 guineas. And this was essentially this was a coffee table publication of Shakespeare's Macbeth. It had wonderful paper, magnificent binding, very good covers. There were illustrations, pictures, and so and so. And Harry Rao had said, and I'll quote his words, talking about the Porter scene, he said that, yes, too many meretricious reeds row upon the banks of Avon. In other words, he is coming to the same conclusion that these words of the Porter scene are not of Shakespeare's authorship, and therefore, you see, even if Shakespeare wrote them, they are some kind of an aberration, and so they should not be treated as, something which is really there in the Shakespeare canon. So this was 1797, incidentally, Harry Rao's edition of Macbeth, once again, where the Porter scene is literally being marginalized. Number 2. Then again, you see, if you look at into the 19th century, and this is Coleridge. What does Coleridge say? Coleridge is saying that the whole Porter scene is, and I'm quoting, a disgusting passage, which I pledge myself to demonstrate to be an interpolation of the actors, unquote. So, according to Coleridge, the whole Porter scene is a disgusting passage. So he doesn't like it, and he says this is not Shakespeare. Once again, this is something which is an ad-libbed, put in, created, intruded by the actors playing Macbeth. And so once again, Coleridge is, doing a kind of a short shrift of Shakespeare's Porter scene. So that is what Coleridge says. On the other hand, in the Romantic period, there was, of course, Thomas de Quincey. Thomas de Quincey, as you remember, wrote a very famous essay which was called On the Knocking at the Gate in Macbeth. Now, you see, what is interesting is that the title says On the Knocking at the Gate in Macbeth. But actually, if you read the essay, you will find that De Quincey does not talk about the knocking at all. Rather, you see, he is only saying that, and I'm quoting the words, the knocking at the gate makes known audibly that the reaction has commenced. The human has made its reflux upon the fiendish, the pulses of life are beginning to beat again. These are De Quincey's words. Once again, what does he really mean by this? What he says is that the sound of the knocking is nothing more than a signal that the reaction has begun, that Macbeth's castle was hell for so long with the murder of the good Duncan, and now the knocking at the gate is symbolizing, indicating, suggesting, is a sign of the fact that the human is reasserting itself. That you see, the sequence in hell is now over. In other words, you see, notice De Quincey is actually taking the sound to represent not, the acoustic element, not to really, he's not engaging really with the sound aspect as such. He's simply saying that the sound is a signal and nothing more than that. A signal that the pulses of life are beginning to renew themselves once again. Now, you see, in the 20th century, so that is from 1725, Pope's edition, to De Quincey, Romantic Age, Plum in the middle of the Romantic Age, to, as I said, Harry Rao, who was 1797. So you see, these are 18th century and 19th century reactions to Shakespeare. Then, but you see, if you look at the 20th century, you will find once again this strange, I think very strange, disregard of the acoustic aspect of what we call the soundscape or the audioscape. Just as there's a landscape, there can be a soundscape. The soundscape is, of course, you see the sound of, or the sounds in a play, the sounds in a film, whatever it is. That is an audioscape or a sonicascape in a film or in a play. You see, once again in the 20th century, critics of Shakespeare were blissfully, I think, ignorant of this aspect of Shakespeare's dramatic art. For example, you see, let me just, give you one or two examples. In the middle of the 20th century, critics of Macbeth, editors of Macbeth, I should say, like Kenneth Muir. Kenneth Muir, as you know, this is the edition that many of us had read as students, and many students even read today. This is, of course, the Arden edition of Shakespeare. And here, Kenneth Muir is suggesting that the Porter scene is a quote-unquote comic relief, which he is implying really goes back to De Quincey. And then he says that it is important because it reflects on the thematic significance of the allusions to the sinners that the porter mentions in the course of his dialogue. Now, I want to read a brief passage from Kenneth Moore because you see, it's important to understand what he's saying. This is what Moore is saying in his edition, the Arden edition of Macbeth. And he writes, the reference to treason in the porter's speech looks back to the executed Thane of Cawdor, the gentleman on whom Duncan had built an absolute trust. So in other words, the reference to treason, Thane of Cawdor is a treasonous person, okay, who had betrayed Duncan. So once again, the reference to treason. And then Moore continues, and it looks forward to the dialogue between Lady Macbeth and her Lady Macduff and her son, and to the long testing of Malcolm by Macduff, which shows the distrust and suspicion which grow from equivocation and hypocrisy. In other words, he is also saying that this is reflecting on the whole notion of distrust, suspicion, equivocation, hypocrisy. And then Moore continues, similarly, the unnaturalness of the avaricious farmer is contrasted with the images of natural growth and harvest which are scattered throughout the play. And he is connected with the equivocator because Garnet went under the alias of farmer. And even the tailor has his place in the scheme of the play because of the clothing imagery which is so abundant in it. In other words, you see, what Moore is doing is to take the words of the porter, the references to treason, the farmer, Father Garnet, and all these other references, and he is relating them to the essential themes of the plays. Once again, notice about the sound of knocking, nothing is said by Moore. But then you see, one has to turn the clock back just a little, because you see, a few years before Kenneth Moore published his edition of Macbeth, there was a critic called John B. Harcourt. And Harcourt wrote an essay which was published in Shakespeare Quarterly, and he wrote, the name of the essay was, I Pray You Remember the Porter. This was published in 1961. And Harcourt is writing, he is saying that such of the porter's words, like say, for example, sweat, goose, tailor, bonfire, and so on. So all these words are the words that the porter uses. He says that these words are not so simple because these words have a scatological significance, a scatological meaning, a scatological implication. Like what? For example, Harcourt is pointing out that in the Elizabethan age, the word sweat, for example, meant the sweating tub, which was the standard Elizabethan therapy for venereal disease. So you see, sweat, according to Porter, is a slang word for a treatment for syphilis. Number one. Two, tailor, he says, in the Elizabethan times was a slang for the penis. Third, the bonfire, which is really bone fire or corpse fire, obviously refers to the burning of a human body. And then, once again, what I want to indicate is that Harcourt has nothing to say about the sound of knocking. Rather, you see, his main point, which is typical of character-centric criticism, is that the low comedy figure of the porter serves to scale down, to desentimentalize and destroy what he calls the pseudo-heroic illusion of the protagonist. Well, let me explain this. So you see, I am saying that number one, Harcourt is drawing attention to the slang implication, the slang meanings of these words, and then words used by the porter, and then he says that the whole intention of the porter scene is to make it clear that, you see, Macbeth is sort of cut down to size. What does he mean by that? What he means simply is this. He says that when we had seen Macbeth commit the ghastly crime of murdering his benefactor, his liege, his relative, Macbeth, despite doing something terrible, had, been in the eyes of the audience an object of awe and fascination, even perhaps of admiration. Because you see, here is this man who does a terrible deed, and so this man is in a sense something of a, if not a superman, but something of a heroic individual, because he has done something which is unimaginable. And then Harcourt says that the Porter scene, because of its comedy, is showing that Macbeth, after all, is not a heroic figure, but that he is desentimentalized. As Harcourt puts it, Macbeth is, desentimentalized, and the pseudo-heroic illusion of the protagonist is destroyed. So once again, the function of the Porter scene is being talked about, not at all anything being said about the sound of the knocking. Now, if you go forward a few more years, there was another critic, Frederick B. Tromley, once again in another edition of Shakespeare Quarterly. He wrote a kind of a rejoinder to Harcourt's essay, and Tromley says that the Porter scene does scale down the murderer, as Harcourt had said. It does belittle the stature of Macbeth, making him more, not less sympathetic to the audience, more recognizably human. In other words, you see what the later critic Tromley is saying, yes, I agree with Harcourt, but you see, Macbeth is not desentimentalized, but rather Macbeth is made more human to the audience. So you see, after the Porter scene, according to this man, you think of Macbeth as a human being, no longer as this, awe-inspiring figure, this terrifying figure, literally, that you had seen in the murder scene. Now, if you think that's long enough in the 20th century, actually it isn't, because you see there were several other things. One of the most interesting ways of looking at the play in the late 20th century was by a critic called Glyn Wickham. Now, Glyn Wickham notes that the sound of the knocking in Macbeth really follows a tradition that people were not aware of very much, the tradition in the medieval morality plays of the depiction of the scene from the Bible of Christ's harrowing of hell. Now, let me explain this a bit. You see, Glyn is actually referring to several of the miracle and the morality plays, and there he is showing that, particularly in the York cycle, the Chester cycle, and the Townley cycle, you had a situation in which Satan is being knocked up by Jesus. Oh, let me explain this a bit. You see, in the medieval cycles, you see, in fact, there was a version of the Bible, not the New Testament as we know it today, not the King James Version, but the older versions of the Bible. In the older versions of the Bible, you see, there was a book called the Book of Nicodemus. This is Apocrypha. You do not find it in the present edition of the Bible. But this was the standard Bible in the Middle Ages. And the story in the Book of Nicodemus is that Jesus Christ has ascended to heaven, on Easter Monday. And as soon as he ascends to heaven, he comes down, he goes to hell, and he bangs on the door of hell, demanding that the souls which have been imprisoned by Satan, by Lucifer, should be released. Why? Because Jesus says, I have bought the souls of these sinners with my blood. And so, these sinners may not be kept in hell any longer, they should be released. Now, this was an episode which was called the Harrowing of Hell. Harrowing, incidentally, for the students here, harrowing means, you see, beating on the door. So, the Harrowing of Hell scene, this was depicted in many of the Townley cycle plays, York cycle plays, and the Chester cycle plays. So you see, there was a long tradition of showing the scene in medieval drama. And Wickham is saying that Shakespeare is actually drawing upon this tradition. But then, Wickham makes another point. He says, don't forget that the miracle plays and the morality plays belong to the older Roman Catholic tradition of church ritual worship in the pre-Elizabethan age, that is in the Middle Ages. Now, with the Elizabethan age, as you know, Roman Catholicism became politically defunct. That is, with the rise of the Church of England and the rise of Puritanism, there was a kind of a dislike or a kind of animosity shown to the Roman Catholics. And Wickham is saying that here, by using the Potter's seal, Shakespeare is actually indicating a politics of culture. What kind of a politics of culture? Very simply put, Wickham is trying to say that Shakespeare is showing the Potter's seal, making the audience remember the harrowing of hell scenes in the older grammatical tradition of the Middle Ages. And then Wickham is saying Shakespeare is also making it clear that the times have changed, Roman Catholics are no longer in fashion, and the Protestant Bible does not have the harrowing of the hell scene or the episode. So you see, this is Wickham's very culturally, politically loaded version of the Potter scene. And I'm going to repeat myself, but let me add once again, no mention at all of the sound of knocking, which is so insistent, so powerful, so pervasive throughout the scene. So that was Wickham, late 20th century. Later on, however, you see, in the very late 20th century, in fact, you see, from the 1980s, 90s onwards, there was a kind of a movement away from reading Shakespeare only from the perspective of politics or society or historiography, or even reading Shakespeare from the point of good old-fashioned character analysis. Because don't forget, you see, it's not only A.C. Bradley who had started this tradition of looking at Shakespeare's characters as human beings. This was there very much embedded in the long history from the 18th century onwards of looking at Shakespeare's plays. But, as I was saying, from the 90s onwards, you see, there was a new interest in Shakespeare's plays which did not look at the characters, but which looked rather at the material aspects of Shakespeare. Now, what is meant by material aspects of Shakespeare? You see, the new awareness was that any play is not only a matter of, to be read on the page. Any play is actually a dramatic performance. And for a dramatic performance to work, you must have not only the physical bodies of the actors, you also must have the properties, the stage props if you want. You also must have the actions on stage, something that is technically known as blocking. And anyone who's into theatre knows this. So, you must have this blocking, the physicalization, the movements, the pitch and the delivery and the accent of the delivery of the words, and so on and so on. In other words, you see, a play is not only a literary artifact, it's a performance medium. And because it's a performance medium, you see, there are these material aspects to any production, any play, which need to be taken care of. The material things, as I said, physical bodies of the actions, the movements on stage, the props that are used on the stage. For example, if you think of Macbeth, what is Macbeth without the taper, the lighted taper that Lady Macbeth carries in her hand in the sleepwalking scene? Or, if you want even, better examples, more vivid examples, what about the daggers that Macbeth enters the stage with after he has committed the offstage murder of Duncan? You see, if he just came on with bare hands, the audience would not have been able to visualize the horrendous nature of the act that he has committed. But when he comes in with the bloodied knives in his hands, that is a kind of an indicator, a physicalization of what Macbeth says that he has done, that he has killed Duncan. Understand? Or if you think of at the end of the play, there's a scene where Macbeth's head is cut off and it's put on a spear, on a pike, and it is displayed all around. Now, once again, you see this cut-off head of Macbeth is naturally a theatrical prop. And once again, this is a kind of a visual representation of the fact that the tyrant is now dead, that Macbeth is now no more. Okay, so you see props are important. And this new reading of Shakespeare looks at these, material objects in Shakespeare, and not only in Shakespeare, in all the Renaissance and in all the Jacobean playwrights as well. And there's a number of books on that. For example, I just mentioned one or two. There's Douglas Bruster's book, Drama and Market in the Age of Shakespeare. There's this edited volume edited by three people, Margareta de Grazia, Maureen Pilligan, and Peter Stallybrass, who wrote this book, or who edited this book, called Subject and Object in Renaissance Culture. And there's also two others. There's a book called Renaissance Culture and the Everyday, edited by Patricia Fumerton and Simon Hunt, in which you see these critics are actually challenging the earlier new historicist or the cultural materialist readings of Shakespeare. People like Stephen Greenblatt, people like Alan Sinfield and the rest, who had theorized Shakespeare from a cultural studies angle without actually looking at the material objects in Shakespearean drama. So you see, from the 1990s onwards, there was this new focus on the objects, material objects, to be found in Shakespeare's drama. And that, I think, is a very significant shift in Shakespeare studies. Okay? Well, then, it's not only props which were overlooked in the traditional mode of Shakespeare criticism late into the 20th century. And as I say, it is only about a decade and a half ago, maybe 15, 20 years maximum, that you see attention began to be given first to the significance of sounds and noises in society, culture, and drama in the age of Shakespeare. Now, this is important. Sounds in Shakespeare. You see, before the late 20th century, no one even thought about discussing, talking about, analyzing the sounds in Shakespeare. But once again, you see, right at the end of the 20th century, you find such books. One of the earliest books was, of course, Bruce Smith's book. It's called The Acoustic World of Early England, Attending to the O Factor. This was published in 1991. And this is one of the books that talks about sound in Shakespeare. This was followed by Wes Falkert's more Shakespeare-centered book, which is called The Sound of Shakespeare, 21st century, 2004. Again, this is interesting. I'll give you a quotation from Falkert, because you see, Falkert is writing, when we speak about listening, about what we hear, how we hear, and who we hear, we are talking about hearing as an ethical act involved in assigning value and recognition to particular elements and events in the acoustic environment. Well, that was a difficult quotation, but let me quickly summarize this. What Falkert is talking about, you see, whenever you talk about hearing, when you hear, and who you hear, we are really engaging ourselves in an ethical act. Why an ethical act? Because you see, whenever we talk about what we hear, how we hear, who we hear, and so on, we give value and recognition to certain elements in the acoustic environment. You see, for example, I put it very simply. You see, if you're thinking of sound, voices speaking, noises being made, and you are reacting to them, it all depends on who is calling you, who is making that noise. Okay? For example, you see, if someone very important to me calls me at this moment, I would obviously listen to him or to her. Okay, if, for example, Pranoti interrupts me and says, Shubhi, this is where I disagree or agree or whatever, okay, you bet I'm going to give her a lot of attention. Isn't it? On the other hand, if there's a stray noise outside, a dog barking on the street outside, obviously you won't listen to it. Isn't it? So you see, you assign value to sounds depending on who is making that sound, how that person is related to you, important, unimportant, non-important, what have you. Understand? So listening is actually an ethical act. It's a conscious decision that you take when you listen to a sound. Okay? And this, I think, is rather interesting because you see, it really relates to a lot of theorization about sound. And some of this theorization I'll be drawing upon and indicating to you as I go along. All right. Now, to move on, you see, I'm seeing that an acoustic environment, what can be called a soundscape, and you remember I talked about landscape, and so corresponding to that, a soundscape. That is, I'm saying that a soundscape is precisely what is evoked in the opening moments of Act 2, Scene 3 in Macbeth, when the porter of Inverness Castle, alone on the stage, engages in his dialogue with the sound of. Now, there's one critic, a man called Kurt Schreier, who has appropriately described the sound of knocking as, and I quote, an oral trop, unquote. Oral trop. It's a wonderful way of putting it, because the sound of knocking is actually an oral trop, because the sound is actually a stage property. But then you see, Schreier doesn't really any attention to this, but he follows upon older critics like Wickham, Glenn Wickham, and he draws attention to the recreation of a sound from the out loud stage tradition. That is, you see, the medieval pre-Reformation liturgical plays, the morality plays and the miracle plays, and he is saying that once again there's a political dimension to this. Okay, in fact, he says that it exposes, and I'm quoting, he exposes the inadequacy of Jacobean political ideology. That's sort of the issue altogether, which I'm not going to go into at the moment. But then you see, another very interesting take on the porter scene was made by a man whose name is Chris Barnett. Chris Barnett wrote a 2013 essay, so roughly 10 years back, 9 years back. In this essay, which is called, quote, "Remember the Porter, knock, knock jokes, tragedy and other unfunny things." Now, once again, knock, knock joke. I'm sure all of you know knock, knock jokes, which is a very established genre in jokes. And in the knock, knock jokes, you see, you have knock, knock, who's there? And then the joke follows. Okay, that's a tradition. Now, Barnett is suggesting that the porter scene is a very early version of a knock-knock joke. Okay, now sounds outlandish, a little, doesn't it? But okay, let me quote this man, Barnett, in order to be fair to him. This is what he says, and I'm quoting. "When the porter appears on stage at Act 2, Scene 3, to answer the knocking at the gate, his 20-line riff assumes the now painfully recognizable form of a knock-knock joke. This first knock-knock joke in English turns out to be just as unsettling as the rest of the play, treating the same preoccupations, treachery, damnation, identity, that haunt the play as a whole. As the porter comes to the end of the joke, we see that the joke is not an interlude or a relief or an indulgence. Rather, it is an unforgiving mirror, like the eighth king's glass that harrows Macbeth, the glass the witches deliver in their final prophetic phantasmagoria, having welcomed their guests with "Open locks, whoever knocks." Now, this was Barnett. So Barnett is suggesting that the porter scene is an early version of a knock-knock joke. Now, how do I react to that? Well, first of all, on one dimension, I'm very sympathetic towards Barnett, because you see, one of my areas of interest, one of my areas of specialization is jokes. I think jokes are very serious. Why? My studies are essentially in ethnic jokes, into war jokes, jokes about very unfunny things. And my point is, you see, a joke can tell you much more about a people's culture, their personalities, their habits, the mentality, than, say, reading up, say, 10 books on political science, 5 books on sociology, 3 books on economics, and things like that. Understand? So you see, jokes are very important. Jokes are very serious, like I always say, because they tell you a great deal about culture. Here you see Barnett is interpolating, or if you want, extrapolating the whole notion of the knock-knock joke and is applying it to Macbeth. The point, of course, is the Porter scene a joke? Now, there's a divided opinion on that. Because some people say that the Porter scene is funny, and a lot of other people say that the Porter scene is not funny. Okay, because you have this drunk man, staggering about on the stage, okay, talking a lot, and many people say that this is not at all fun, because obviously, this is a distraction from the scene before, but it is not really funny. And so whether the Porter scene is a joke at all is a question that needs to be debated and thought about further. Right. Now, I'm saying that, it's possible to argue that all these readings of the Porter scene fail to pay any special attention to the noise of the knocking sound itself. In fact, I would say that most reading of the Porter scene for 200 plus years has in reality do not look beyond the specifically moral, social, or political domains of significance in which critical studies have traditionally tended to locate the scene and the noise that runs through it as an insistent, potent, and completely unignorable dialogic counterweight. So my claim is that the Porter scene and the sound of the knocking is a dialogical counterweight. On the one hand, you have the sound of the human dialogues. On the other, you have the material sound of the knocking. And so it's a kind of a counterweighting one by the other. And that is what I think is fascinating about the Porter scene. But I'll move on. First of all, if you look at the theorization of sounds, that's very important because sounds have been, or rather I should say not sounds really, the ontology of auditory perception has been described as intentional objects of audition. What does it mean? It means that whenever you make a sound, particularly in drama or any place else, you are making that sound as an intentional gesture. Even if a sound is made unintentionally, you drop a teacup, you drop a bowl, okay, there's a loud sound. Even that it may be apparently intentional, but once again, the effect of that unintentionality is, of course, drawing everyone's attention to that sound. Okay, so sounds are never quite without significance. Sound also always means a kind of a factor in which people's attention are being drawn to it. Okay, go on. Now, I would argue from that the stage effect of the sound of knocking was used by Shakespeare in his plays in a number of plays. For example, apart from Macbeth, you find the sound of knocking in Henry IV Part 1, Henry IV Part 2, in Julius Caesar, in Measure for Measure, in Romeo and Juliet, in Troilus and Cressida, in Cymbeline, in Richard III, and in Titus Andronicus. Okay. Now, that's rather interesting because it shows that, the sound of knocking is something that Shakespeare was quite accustomed to using in his plays. Okay, so knocking as an oral prop is there in many of Shakespeare's plays. But I want to make a discrimination here. In most of these plays, the sound effect of knocking is heard not more than once or twice or maybe 3 times. Only in Romeo and Juliet, Act 3, Scene 3, are knocks heard 4 times. So all the sounds of knocking can be heard once, twice, thrice, 4 times maximum. But in Macbeth, the sound of knocking is used no less than 10 times with the space of a few minutes of performance time. In other words, in Macbeth, and Macbeth is unique because Shakespeare uses 10 sounds of knocking within a few minutes. That obviously underscores, validates my point that the sound of knocking is something of central importance in Macbeth's Porter scene. Let me go on. Depending on the loudness and on the tenor of the sound produced, A knock or a series of knocks may signal several things. What are these things? First of all, it may signal a request for attention. Or a knock can signal a discreet or an urgent call for attention, for action. Or it can be a strident demand for response. Okay, three ways that people react to sounds. First of all, a knock can be a request for attention. You want to draw someone's attention, so you knock on the door. It can be an urgent call for action. You want to, desperately want someone to help you, so you knock hard. Or, you really demand that some people hear you, so you bang, bang, bang. You make a strident demand for response. Now, you see, in Macbeth, it's clear enough that Malcolm and Macduff's knocks on the gate of Inverness Castle are not of the order of discreet taps that the conspirators bestow on Brutus's door in Julius Caesar, but high decibel soundings that penetrate the walls of the castle to hear the ears, to reach the ears of both Lady Macbeth and Macbeth inside the castle. Let me explain this. You see, if you think of Julius Caesar, it's the middle of the night. The conspirators have come to Brutus to convince him about the importance of him, Brutus, joining their cause against Julius Caesar, and they knock on the door of Brutus. How do they knock? Loudly? No, not at all. They tap on the door of Brutus. Okay. In the quarter scene, the knocks of Malcolm and Macduff outside Macbeth's castle are not discreet taps. They are bang, bang, bang sounds. And they are so loud, as I say, they reach even the ears of Lady Macbeth and Macbeth inside the thick walls of the castle. So you see, obviously, the order of the two knocks in Julius Caesar and in Macbeth are completely different, isn't it? And you see, if you think to the situation of the play as it is being performed in the theatre in Shakespeare's own age, don't forget that the sound of the knocking would be loudly audible to the audience sitting or standing within the Globe Theatre itself. Why is this? Now, once again, you see, this is something which has been researched on recently. Bruce Smith, for example, has written on this. Smith writes that, you see, the structure of the Globe Theatre, which was, roughly cylindrical, actually it was octagonal. So the structure of the Globe Theatre, the fact that it was made of lath and plaster, a horse hair or cow hair mixed with plaster, that was how the walls were made. Okay. The idea is the walls of the Globe Theatre were acoustically very efficient. Why? Because don't forget, in Shakespeare's day, you see, a couple of thousand people used to cram into the very small theatres. And people had to hear even the soliloquies. Okay. And so you see, acoustics was important. And the structure of the Globe Theatre was such that people inside the auditorium could hear any even small, faint sound made on the stage. So you see, when the sound of knocking is heard off stage in Macbeth, in the performance of Macbeth, you can be jolly well sure that everyone in the audience would hear it loud and strong. Okay? So you see, the sound of knocking is reaching the ears of the people sitting inside the audience, or sitting in the audience. Okay? Now, you see, what I'm saying is that the sound of knocking leaves an effect on the audience, just as it creates an effect on the characters who hear the sound of knocking. In other words, we all know that, Lady Macbeth and Macbeth react to the sound of knocking as characters, but that's not all. I'm suggesting that the audience members also react to the sound of knocking. Okay, and let me just quickly go over this a little. But before I do that, you see, modern-day psychologists who have researched the effect produced on the human system by loud noises have categorized by the term noise annoyance a symptomatic, and I quote, negative attitude towards a specific noise or noisy environments. And they go on and say that, you see, and this is of course psychologists who have studied noise, they say that noise can create a feeling of annoyance, displeasure. Okay, It can be distracting. It can be something which makes work performance difficult or even less effective, and so and so. It can even encourage people to get out of an unpleasantly noisy environment as quickly as they can, and so and so. But you see, there seems to be a different opinion altogether about the effect that sounds like music, for example, produce in audiences in the fields of such performances as cinema and theatre. In other words, you see, now I want to focus on the impact of the sound of music in theatre and in cinema. Because you see, you can't have theatre or cinema without the use of noise, sound. Okay, it's audio visual after all. And so you see, two recent critics who have written on sonic semiotics, these are people called Chris Arning and Alex Gordon. They say that there exist different views about the relationship of the performative, moving imagery of films and sound or music. According to these critics, one school of thought suggests that the mood, that the sound effects like music should support the mise en scene, embellishing the mood and character and it is presented, and ensuring that the audience understands the significance of the moment. Let me explain this. Essentially, what they're saying is that the sound should enhance the mood of what is going on. So you see, if in a film or in a play you have a very tragic moment, a moment of pathos, you would have music which is, essentially long drawn out, slow and sad. Something like a violin music playing a very melancholy tune. Okay. On the other hand, if you have a more happy moment, naturally the scene must be also mood entertaining or mood enhancing, and the tune must be more fast. So that's the way in which music in theatre and in film are composed. Now, I am saying, you see, that in Macbeth, the offstage noise of the knocking harshly intrudes into our consciousness as we engage as spectators or audience or even as readers with the situation and the actions of the onstage protagonist with whom we feel a sense of identification and emotional engagement. Let me explain this. You see, okay, we know when Macbeth comes back with his hands full of blood that he's done this terrible crime. What are your reactions as members of the audience or as readers of the play to Macbeth at that point? Well, obviously you're revolted by what he has done, but at the same time you see, because we are watching Macbeth and Lady Macbeth alone on stage at that time, I would suggest that we also have an element of sympathy for Macbeth. That is, you see, we almost automatically identify ourselves with the situation, or if you want, the predicament of Macbeth at that point. That is, you see, you see Macbeth on the stage and you can't help but feeling a sense of sympathy, empathy, identification with Macbeth. Okay? And so when you hear the sound of knocking, what happens? What are your reactions? First of all, you jump, because the sound of knocking is completely unexpected. Number one. And when you jump, you think, what is going to happen now? Will Lady Macbeth be caught? Okay, and if they're caught, what's going to happen? So you see, there's a friction of tension that is being created in your minds by the sound of knocking as you're watching Macbeth and Lady Macbeth alone on the stage. And as I said, you identify yourself instinctively with the characters playing these roles. Okay? And so the sound of knocking is an intrusion on our consciousness, and it creates in us a sense of suspense which comes from a fear of a premature detection and a possibly disastrous consequence for Macbeth and his partner in crime, his wife. Okay, in other words, it creates a powerful emotional reaction in us. Now, don't forget, this is the sound of knocking in the murder scene. Act 3, Act 2, Scene 2. I would suggest that in Act 2, Scene 3, the Porter scene, the sound of the knocking is entirely different. Why? Because you see, in the Porter scene, the deed of murder has been accomplished, has been done. Okay, the murderers have sort of, evaded any chance of immediate detection or incrimination. Lady Macbeth has been very straightforward about it. I mean, she's very insouciant about this, because she says that, a little water clears us of this deed. So there's nothing much. Okay. Sword. I mean, okay, we have blood on our hands. We'll just, wash the blood off, and that's really okay. So once again, you see, after the tension we felt for the possible detection of the crime of Lady Macbeth and Macbeth, Lady Macbeth's reassurance to us that nothing's going to happen, everything is okay, had reassured us. But I'm saying that in the later sound of knocking in the Porter scene, Act 2, Scene 3, is far less effective. Why? Because you see, as the porter comes in, the knocking becomes a kind of an engaging sonic effect. So it is not something vitally important, it becomes something only, which is interesting, something that we engage with. Now, okay. Okay, let me explain the difference between the two once again. You see, if you think of the murder scene, the sound of the knocking had come immediately after, in fact, it had climaxed the dialogue, the crosstalk between Macbeth and Lady Macbeth. And lines all of you know. Macbeth says, "I have done the deed. Didst not hear a noise?" And Lady Macbeth says, "I heard the owl scream and the crickets cry. Did not speak?" And Macbeth says, "When?" Lady Macbeth says, "Now." Macbeth, "As I descended?" Lady Macbeth, "I." Macbeth, "Hark. Who lies in the second chamber?" Lady Macbeth, "Donald Bean." If you look at these lines on the printed page, you will find that, these lines are broken up. Why? Because the broken up nature of the lines is actually indicating the tension in the mind of Macbeth and Lady Macbeth. Okay, so you see here, what you find is that the sound of knocking is actually climaxing this tension-ridden episode in the Porter scene. But, not in the Porter scene, in the murder scene, sorry. In the Porter scene, however, the sound of knockings are set off only by the quasi-comical musings of a clearly drunk servant. And so you see, I'm suggesting that the Porter scene sounds of knocking are different from the sounds of knocking in the previous scene. Okay. Now, at this point, let me bring in a bit of Roller Barthes. Now, Barthes wrote a very important book many of you know about. It's called The Responsibility of Forms. Now, Barthes, in this book, talks about the difference between the physiological act of hearing and the psychological performance of listening. And further, Barthes is providing a kind of a listing, a taxonomy of listening, in which the first and the most basic level is that of the ordering of sounds by humans and animals alike. This form of listening, Barthes distinguishes from a second type that is founded on the understanding of the socio-cultural codes that underline signs, or, in Barthes' words, I quote, on the oscillation that of the marked and the non-marked, unquote. And Barthes, both the first and the second orders are, however, different from the third order, which, Barthes is saying, quote, does not aim at or await certain determined classified signs, not what is said or emitted, but who speaks, who emits. Such listening is supposed to develop in an intersubjective space where I am listening also means listening to me, unquote. Now, this is high theorization. I won't go into it at this moment because it's going to take a lot of time. But I just want to indicate, you see, that Barthes' ideas actually go back to Ferdinand de Saussure. Ferdinand de Saussure, in his book, very famous book, on linguistics, Course on General Linguistics, had talked about sound images, and these are Saussure's words, quote, the psychological imprint of sound, the impression it makes on our senses. So sound images are the psychological imprint of sound, the impression it makes on our senses. Now this is interesting, you see. Why? Because these aspects or these theorizations, if you want, are important also to us gaining a fresh insight into the reception of the sound of knocking and Macbeth by both the heroes and the protagonists in this play, also by the more carnivalesque figure of the porter. Why? First of all, because you see, Macbeth and Lady Macbeth's responses appear to be of the first order of listening identified by Bath. But the porter's reaction seems to be consistent with Bath's second norm or category of response to an auditory stimulus. Let me quickly go over this. Let me simplify a bit maybe, because I'm really getting very theoretical. Well, first of all, you see, if you think of it, the porter is a more proactive listener than either Macbeth or his wife. Why? Because you see, Lady Macbeth reacts to the knocking as a species of cautioning. That is, as a sign signaling to them about the importance of washing up and changing their clothes. And so you see, the sound is only like the sound of the bell that Macbeth hears in the murder scene, the beginning of the murder scene, which tells him that the time for murdering Duncan has come. Now, however, in the porter's dialogue and the sound of knocking there, we have a more complex cycle of response. Why? Now, you see, if you think of the question, what's that sound? What is the reaction? We'll often think that, you see, what's that sound is actually engaging in us a kind of a responsiveness. That is, you see, given the fact that the porter hears a sound which the audience also hears, the precise origin of which is left ambiguous even to the porter as he talks back to it, the sound is actually indicating the presence of someone standing outside demanding an entry. Let me explain this. What I'm trying to say is that, you see, the porter hears the sound of knocking. He doesn't know who is knocking. All that he registers is that someone is outside wanting to come in. Okay? But you see, the porter delays in taking the necessary action of opening the gate and indulges instead in an activity in which, you see, he is also almost replying to the sound of knocking by saying, "Listen to me." Let me explain this. Essentially, you see, obviously there's someone knocking and the porter's responsibility, job is to go and open the gate. But instead of doing that immediately, he uses the time at his disposal to talk back to the sound. Okay? And that is important. Why? Because, you see, I would suggest that, you see, okay, let me turn once again to a theory a bit. This is Roman Jakobson. In the first of his lectures, in a series that he wrote called Lectures on Sound, Sound and Meaning, Jakobson makes a very significant reference to Edgar Allan Poe's poem, The Raven. Now, you see, this poem I think is very interesting because it's actually a kind of an intertext, a later intertext of the porter scene in Macbeth. Why? Because in this poem, Poe is also embodying a dialogue between a sound, that is a sound of a rapping at my chamber door, and then the cawing of a raven and human interlocutor. Let me explain this. These are Poe's lines. You see, the speaker is saying, "Then upon the velvet sinking." Anyway, you know the background of the poem, don't you? The background of the poem is, here is this man sitting in his study. Suddenly he hears the sound of a raven, a crow, tapping on his door. And then he hears the sound of the raven crowing, cawing, and so he listens to that. And then comes these lines. Then, upon the velvet sinking, I betook myself to thinking, linking fancy unto fancy, thinking what this ominous bird of yore, what this grim, ungainly ghastly, warned, an ominous bird of yore, meant in croaking nevermore. Now, once again, you see here, therefore, the narrator of this poem, the speaker in this poem, The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe, is talking back to the sound of a raven, of a crow. And I'm saying, you see, like the narrator in Pope's poem, who links fancy with fancy about the meaning of the raven's croaking, the porter in Shakespeare fancies into existence a whole series of minor sinners knocking at the gate of hell, of which he is the keeper. And there are several perspectives from which this may be regarded. In the first place, you see, the porter is akin to a hermeneutical or hermeneutist in his function as an interpreter, creating what Gadamer calls a representation in order with the meaning the interpreter finds in it. Let me explain this. You see, one of my areas of specialization is hermeneutics. Hermeneutics is, of course, about meaning and the making of meaning. And so you see, I would say that the porter is actually a hermeneutist. Why? Because the porter is making meaning out of the sounds of knocking that he hears. Okay, so number one, the porter is a hermeneutist of one order at least. Then you see, because the identity of the knocker is unknown to the porter at the time he talks back to it, he's also a man indulging in a kind of an imaginative iconization. You know, what is the porter really doing? The porter is creating into existence, imagining into existence, a series of characters. Isn't it? Like what? I'll just go over this point a little. For example, you see, I would say that the porter is something of a dramatist himself, a quasi-artist if you want, something akin to a preacher, or a man indulging in a kind of a imaginative iconization. I would say that, you see, the porter is a person whose evocations of the different characters are of the order of the exempla horrendum, which was typical of the liturgical tradition in the time of Shakespeare. Now, for students, let me explain this. You see, exemplum horrendum was when a preacher in the church would talk about the horrors of hell. The preachers would warn about this, and they would so the preachers would go to. Yeah, can you still hear me? I hope so. Yeah. So the preachers would go on and on of talking about, you see, what is going to happen to sinners in hell. The whole idea of the preachers was to bring men back into the path of the church, of the faith, and so on and so on. In case you have read A Portrait to the Artist as a Young Man by Joyce, you remember in the novel, there's a sermon that the protagonist Stephen Dedalus goes to. And there, once again, you see, the preacher is talking about all the terrible things that are going to happen to the dead souls in hell. That is a very good example of a exemplum horrendum. Example, horrendum of horror. An example of horror. Okay. So what I'm saying is that the porter is really like a preacher giving an exemplum horrendum. Why? Because, he's talking about sinners, and he's talking about what is going to happen to these sinners. Okay. In fact, you see, what I'm trying to say is that, if you look at the graphic descriptions of the myriad sinners, which are conjured up in the mind or by the mind of the porter is actually like kind of a dramaturg, a kind of a dramatist himself. I'll give you an example from the text. This is what the porter says. Here's a farmer that hanged himself on the expectation of plenty. Come in, time server. Have napkins enough about you. Here you'll sweat for it. And he goes on. Faith, here's an equivocator that could swear in both scales against either scale, who committed treason enough for God's sake, and yet could not equivocate to heaven. Oh, come in, equivocator. So you see, farmer, equivocator, these are characters almost in a kind of a play within a play. isn't it? A play within a play in which the porter is the dramaturg, that is, the scriptwriter, the playwright, the dramatist, and so on. So, also, if you look at these lines once again, I'll just read the lines because this is another important. The porter says, "Here's a farmer that hanged himself on the expectation of plenty. Come in time, server, have napkins enough about you. Here you'll sweat for it." Then he continues, "Faith, here's an equivocator that could swear in both scales against the other, and so and so, yet could not equivocate to heaven. Oh, come in, equivocator." You see, I would like to suggest, if you look at this dialogue carefully, you will notice that the porter here oscillates from a descriptive register pronounced as a kind of a dramatic aside. Like what? Here's a farmer that hanged himself. It's almost like he's pointing a finger, gesturing towards the farmer. Here's a farmer that hanged himself. Okay. Or, faith, here's an equivocator that could swear, etc. So you see, in these words, you have a kind of a descriptive register. The porter almost introducing a character to the audience, the character almost, virtually coming on the stage. So that's one. But you see, there's also an oscillation here from the descriptive register. There's an oscillation to an idiom of direct address. Why? Because the porter says, "Come in, time server. Oh, come in." In other words, you see, the porter is fancifully evoking and creating a character for the enjoyment of the audience or the reader before including himself as another actor in an imaginary enactment of his ushering in of a visitant. Okay, so you see, the porter is actually introducing a character and then, introducing himself into the imagined action that he's presenting to the audience. Understand? So the porter is a kind of a dramatist figure. Now, you see, this is interesting. Why? Because never forget that in Shakespeare's times, you see, the clowns, they had the liberty of ad-libbing, interpolating their own dialogues as they went along in order to show their wit. Okay, so you see, when the porter is doing this, you see, he is actually following this tradition of the comic actors in Shakespeare, often introducing their own words into the dialogue. And you see, some of the last words of the porter that mark the end of his dialogue with the sound of knocking are also quite significant. For example, the last words are, "I'll devil porter it no further." Now, when he says, "I'll devil porter it no further," this, I say, is indicating his self-termination of his own dramatic evocation. That is, you see, it's almost, he's signing out. He says, "Okay, that's done. Okay, I'll take a bow," that kind of a thing. I'll come to this later also, but at the moment, you see, I would like to say that in a sense, the porter is like Shakespeare's Prospero. Why? Because you see, Prospero creates illusions before he terminates them himself. Okay, and of course, you can say that Prospero is a greater illusionist since he raises up audiovisual spectacles, whereas the porter evokes only audioscapes. But once again, you see, he is quite confident. The porter is quite confident of his own abilities. And so he figuratively takes a bow with an epilogic, and his words are, "I pray you remember the porter," before he opens the gate and lets the knockers in. In other words, the porter is a kind of a dramatist, and the last words of the porter are like an epilogue. And epilogues, even Shakespeare used these epilogues in his plays, in which he signed off, as it were, from the action by talking directly or addressing directly the audience. The porter is doing exactly the same thing. In other words, Shakespeare is no mean dramatist himself. And the whole porter scene is a play within a play. Understand? Okay? That's what I'm getting at. Yes. So you see, what I'm also suggesting is that the porter scene is almost a kind of a meta-theatrical example. Meta-theatricality, as you all know, is theater about theater. And so you see here, we have three different dimensions of the porter. First of all, we have first the motif of representation. That is, you see, the porter represents the damned souls. And this representation is framed within a representation of the porter's projection of himself as the hell gate porter. And finally, this second representation is enclosed within another representation, a third one, of the porter as Shakespeare's creation. So you see three different modes of meta-theatricality. Number one, the porter is representing the damned souls. The porter is representing himself as Hell Gates porter. And finally, the porter is Shakespeare's representation. So you have a representation within a representation within a representation. Okay. And you see, there are many ways you can look at this. One of the ways you can look at this is to see it from the point of view of semiotics. In semiotics, which is of course the science of signs, and theatrical semiotics particularly, people have said that in the Elizabethan age, there was a shift from the medieval dramatic tradition. I'll just summarize this in a couple of sentences, or I'll try to summarize in a couple of sentences. It may be 4 sentences, but okay. The first sentence is, you see, in the Middle Ages, when the audiences watched the scenes from the Bible being enacted, they were convinced that what they were seeing on the stage was actually the word of the Bible. That is, you see, when they saw the devil on the stage, they felt that the devil is the devil. Okay? However, in the Elizabethan or the Jacobean age, the audiences had become far more sophisticated. And now you see, the audiences would see a character on the stage but would not think that this character is real. They would understand or appreciate the fact that this character is only representational, that this character is only a man acting in the role of a man or a woman. Okay, let me explain this simply. If you think back to our own tradition, you know, in many parts of India, there is this tradition of enacting Krishna Leela. Okay, and I'm sure you know that when enactments of Krishna Leela go on, people in the audience literally sit with their hands folded together as they watch the actors and the actresses perform Krishna Leela. Why do they do that? Because you see, this is a kind of a suspension of disbelief in the mind of the people sitting in the audience. You see, when you're watching a theatrical performance which is also a religious ritual, then you tend to believe that the theatrical performance is not theater, but this is reality. Okay. To put it simply, you see, if you're watching a Ram Leela or a Krishna Leela, whatever it is, okay, and you're sitting in the audience, and if your heart is full of faith, you would imagine, at least for a few seconds or a few minutes, that what you're watching on stage is not a man or a woman acting in the role of Radha or Krishna. You would literally imagine for a few seconds at least that what you're seeing is really Radha, really Krishna. Understand? Okay, so this is a high density semioticity. This is an example of high density semioticity. On the other hand, if you're watching a play in a theater, the element of faith is not there. And because the element is not faith is not there, you do not convince yourself that what you're seeing on stage is real. You really become quite accustomed, quite knowledgeable of the fact that what you're watching on the stage is only a performance, not reality. Understand? Okay. And what I'm trying to say is that the whole porter scene, which is a representation enclosed in a representation, which is enclosed in another representation, is example of meta-theatricality. It's an example of a low-density semioticity, is what people understood in Shakespeare's age, that the porter is only a character, not really a living embodiment of a porter. And by showing the theatricality of the porter, Shakespeare is drawing attention to this low-density semioticity in this play. But you see, let me try to wrap up what I've said so far. What I'm saying is that, you see, if as a micro specimen of Elizabethan Jacobean dramaturgy, the knocking sequence in the Porter scene of Macbeth may be conceived as a kind of laboratory of significance or signification, the revelation provided at the end that it was Malcolm and Macduff who were all along the real knockers explodes and exposes the Porter's multiple semiotizations of the signifiers, the sound of the knocks. Let me explain this. You see, essentially what happens is that the Porter has said the knockers are this. Okay. And he has been very convincing about who the knockers are. But at the end of the play, the knockers are revealed to be what they really are. That is Macduff and Malcolm. Okay. And at that point, you see, the Porter's multiple semiotization of the signifiers, that is the sound of the knocks, is exploded. It is exposed. And you see, the reception of and the diverse interpretive responses to the sound of knocking in this play thus assumes a dimension of not only a Baudrillardian simulacrum, which bears, according to Baudrillard, no relation to any reality whatsoever, but an element in an empire of science, but also quite literally becomes a locus of a problematic epistemological and hermeneutic question, drawing entirely on the perception of a playwright and thinker as profound of William Shakespeare. Now, what is Shakespeare trying to indicate? I would suggest at the end, and once again, I'm going to draw upon Paul Ricoeur, the hermeneutist. Paul Ricoeur had this wonderful sentence. Paul Ricoeur writes, "What kind of being is it whose being consists of understanding?" Once again, what kind of being is it whose being consists of understanding? He's talking about human beings. Human beings are beings whose existence, whose being consists of understanding. That is, you see, we are human beings because our existences consist of what we understand, of what we think is the reality around ourselves. In other words, the philosophical import of this is you are what you are because you interpret the reality around you according to your own necessities, needs, requirements. And man is nothing, or human beings are nothing more than interpretive creatures. And you see, I suggest that this is exactly what Shakespeare is indicating through the Porter scene in a high philosophical sense. As the Porter tries to make sense, and as we as members of the audience see the Porter trying to make sense and finally come to a conclusion about the reality of the sound of the knocking, we understand that Shakespeare is indicating to us that we are like the Porter ourselves. That is, we are human beings who live by the making of meaning. And that is why the Porter scene is not trivial. The Porter scene is, as I was suggesting, something of typical, very serious dramatic import, something of great philosophical implication, something that leads us into the understanding of Shakespeare's art and into Shakespeare's mind as a philosopher, as a playwright, and a man of genius who we are even today celebrating in India. Thank you very much. Now, would there be any question-answer session? Usha?
Yes, let's see how many of them have some questions. Deepthi, please ask.
Actually, I was searching for it, ma'am, but it seems there are no questions.
Yeah, no questions as yet.
Yeah, no questions, sir. It was so well delivered that I think everything is crystal clear for everyone.
Even if someone is, Deepthi, even if someone is interested, they can unmute themselves and ask questions.
Yes. Does anyone have questions? Anyone from the audience, participants?
Well, I feel like the porter waiting for the knocks.
Right. Thank you, sir. Thank you. The session was very interesting, insightful, and it was multi-dimensional, and of course, scholarly presentation. And I'm sure the students as well as the other participants would have enjoyed an entirely new perspective on looking at the Porter scene of Macbeth, which was laid by bare by you, sir. Thank you so much. And again, one thing that I feel that the sounds of Shakespeare can never be overlooked now that we were part of this lecture. So thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
You're
Now
welcome.
right.
And you see, the lecture itself was an episode of sound.
I know. I know. Right. I think now we'll proceed to the formal vote of thanks. So at the outset, I would like to thank Dr. Subir Dhar, today's speaker, for accepting our invitation and presenting such a mind-provoking lecture. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. I'm grateful to the President, Shakespeare Society of Central India, Dr. Pranoti Chakravarti, for the involvement, guidance, and encouragement she always provides on such occasions. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much. Thanks is also due to Dr. Urmila Dabir, Chairperson, Board of Studies, and Principal Rajkumar kewalramani Kanya Mahavidyalaya for providing unending support to conduct the certificate course. Thank you, ma'am. Now, without Dr. Usha Sakure's initiative, who is Secretary, Shakespeare Society of Central India, and Principal Manohar Rao Kamli Mahavidyalaya, this course would not have happened. So, thank you, ma'am, for taking this initiative for the benefit of the students. And I'm also thankful to the principals of the organizing colleges, Dr. Prashant Shelke, Dr. Priya Banzari, Dr. Vikas Dhomne, for providing the platform for organizing this online course. Thank you all to all the coordinators of this lecture series, namely Dr. Veena Joseph, Dr. Nihal Sheikh, Dr. Madhvi Mohoril, and Dr. Kartik Panikkar for all the hard work and inputs you have put in to make this course feasible. Thank you all. I'm also grateful to the participants for their active participation. And last but not the least, thanks to all the technicians and all those who were involved directly and indirectly to make this course a virtual reality. Thank you all once again. And before we part, a gentle reminder that we'll meet again at 2 in the afternoon for the lecture by Dr. Supant Bhattacharya, who will deal with the topic, the purpose of mystical phenomena in Macbeth. So thank you all. Goodbye for now. Thank you.
Goodbye and thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.